All right, strap yourselves in for this one, because today we're diving deep into a real powder keg.
Oh, I like that. Powder keg.
We're talking about Martin Sellner, the Austrian activist who's really got Europe talking.
Yeah, he's a fascinating guy.
Some are calling him a visionary, others say he's a straight-up dangerous extremist.
It's a real head-scratcher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're going to break it all down, look at his motives and his actions, and see if we can answer the ultimate question. Grifter or gifted?
Love it.
We've got a ton of stuff to dig into. Articles, Wikipedia pages, even some pretty opinionated blog posts. It's going to be a wild ride.
Definitely. And what I find really intriguing about Sellner is how he dances on that line between charisma and controversy.
Yeah, he's got that whole defender of European culture thing going on.
Right. But then his rhetoric, it often takes a hard turn into, well, dangerous territory.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And that's why this deep dive is so important. It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces are, well, let's just say, intentionally misleading. You ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's do it. I think a good place to start is to understand the playing field Sellner operates on. He's one of the founders of the Identitarian Movement of Austria.
Right, I've heard of them.
And they are fiercely opposed to Muslim immigration and this idea of the Great Replacement.
Yeah, I've heard that term thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean?
Well, it's basically a conspiracy theory. It claims there's this plan to replace native Europeans, with non-Europeans. And it's often portrayed as being orchestrated by, this shadowy elite. Now, it's been debunked over and over again, but it's still incredibly powerful at mobilizing fear and resentment, which, let's face it, is something Sellner seems to be, capitalizing on.
Yeah, and it's not just talk, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the guy's been involved in some pretty wild actions. Like that time he chartered a boat to mess with migrant rescue operations in the Mediterranean.
Oh, you're talking about the 2017 incident. That was a real turning point for him in terms of public attention.
Yeah.
His claim was that he was exposing the hypocrisy of these NGOs who were helping illegal immigration. But a lot of critics saw it as this dangerous stunt, aimed at intimidating migrants, maybe even putting them in danger.
It does make you wonder, is it genuine activism or is it just a grab for attention? Like, which one is it?
Exactly.
And then there's that whole incident where his group stormed that stage play, the one by the Jewish playwright.
Oh, right. They poured fake blood everywhere, accusing the actors of hypocrisy.
Yeah, the whole thing was pretty dramatic and disturbing.
It definitely raises some eyebrows. And it's important to remember his past.
Okay.
Sellner was involved in neo-Nazi activity when he was just a teenager.
Wow.
Even put swastika stickers on a synagogue.
Seriously?
Yeah. He claims he's broken away from all that now, but when you see incidents like that stage play disruption, well, you can't help but question how much he's actually changed,
Yeah, it makes you wonder. It feels almost calculated, like he knows the old school neo-Nazi image is a turnoff for a lot of people, so he's rebranded himself and the whole identitarian movement as something a bit more, well, digestible, more modern.
Exactly. You see it in their sleek graphics, the way they use social media. They even talk about fighting for the environment, all these things to attract a younger audience, a more mainstream crowd. So is it a real shift in his beliefs, or is it just clever marketing to repackage far-right ideas? That's the question.
It's a chilling thought, for sure. So how does he go from those attention-grabbing stunts to actually laying out his big vision? What's his plan?
Well, one way he does that is through his writing. Sellner's written a few books, including one called Regime Change from the Right.
Okay.
And in it, he outlines his whole plan for stopping this, as he calls it, Great Replacement, and offers up his solution, Remigration.
Remigration, huh? What's that all about?
Basically, it boils down to encouraging, incentivizing migrants to voluntarily go back to their countries of origin. He's talking financial support, rebuilding homes and infrastructure, creating a more welcoming environment back in those countries.
On the surface, it sounds pretty humane.
Yeah, but critics see it as this really dangerous euphemism for forced deportation.
Ah.
And they argue that his proposals are just inherently racist and discriminatory. They point out that a lot of these migrants have built lives in their new homes. They have families. They don't want to go back to places they might have fled from, because of conflict or persecution.
It's a pretty extreme solution, no matter how he tries to sugarcoat it. It's like that classic tactic of making something controversial seem more palatable.
Right.
But if he's being so vocal about all this, how has he managed to avoid, the mainstream scrutiny that usually comes with these kinds of views?
Well, he hasn't completely. I mean, Sellner has definitely faced a lot of pushback for what he says. He's actually been banned from a whole bunch of social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, even Spotify. He even calls it the digital death penalty.
Oh, wow.
Says it's an attempt to silence dissenting voices.
Playing the victim card a little bit there. So are these bans justified, or is he really being silenced?
That's a tough one. It's a really complex issue, no easy answers.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have the right to free speech, right? But on the other hand, these platforms, they've got rules against hate speech, against inciting violence, which, let's be honest, Sellner has broken repeatedly. So is he being silenced unfairly, or is this just what happens when you do the things he's done? It's a lot to think about.
It really makes you question his motives, right? Like,
Yeah.
if his ideas are being censored, maybe he's onto something. Or is he deliberately poking the bear to get banned, so he can fuel this whole martyr image and get even more attention?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's very strategic, that's for sure.
Yeah, very calculated. And speaking of strategy, things get even more interesting when you look at his political connections. I mean, he's been linked to far-right parties like the Alternative for Germany.
AAFD, yeah.
And he was a key player in that super secretive meeting of right-wing extremists back in 2023 in Potsdam. What was the deal with that?
That Potsdam meeting was a big deal.
Okay.
You had members of the AFD, the Identitarian Movement, even some folks from the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, all gathered under the radar to talk about, get this, a master plan for remigration.
A master plan. That sounds pretty ominous.
Oh, it was. Sellner's plan involved moving millions of people out of Germany using financial incentives and maybe some not-so-voluntary measures. He even suggested putting pressure on foreign restaurants and businesses to close up shop, making it harder for migrants to, feel welcome and integrate.
That's chilling. It sounds like he's trying to create a hostile environment so migrants just feel like they have to leave. This isn't just talk anymore. It's like a strategy for reshaping society.
Exactly. And the fact that this meeting included members of mainstream parties like the CDU, that's really concerning.
Yeah.
It suggests that Sellner's ideas, which were once considered fringe, they're gaining traction in the mainstream.
So is he influencing the political scene, or is he just riding a wave of existing sentiment? That's a big question.
Absolutely.
We definitely need to dig into that more. But first, let's take a little break and then come back to peel back the next layer of this very complicated story. All right, so we've established that Sellner knows how to push buttons and grab headlines. But how does he actually spread his message? Especially given that he's been booted off mainstream social media. You'd think that would silence him, but it seems like he's doing better than ever.
That's where his savvy really shines. Sellner has been incredibly strategic about building a following on these alternative platforms like Telegram,
Yeah, Telegram.
which is super popular with far-right groups because, let's be honest, their content moderation is pretty lax. He also uses his website and email list to communicate directly with his supporters. It's like he's bypassing the traditional media gatekeepers entirely.
So he's created his own little echo chamber where his ideas can just bounce around without any real scrutiny or fact-checking.
Exactly. And those echo chambers are so powerful when it comes to reinforcing existing beliefs and, potentially radicalizing people. When you're constantly bombarded with the same ideas, especially if they confirm your biases, it becomes really hard to think critically or even consider other points of view.
Which brings us back to that whole grifter or gifted question. If he's intentionally creating an environment where there's no room for dissenting voices, it really makes you question his motives. Is this about genuine dialogue, or is it about building an army of followers who don't question anything he says?
It's a tough one to answer for sure. I mean, only Sellner truly knows what his intentions are. But let's not forget about the money trail. The guy profits from his activism. He's selling books, merchandise, taking donations. There's a clear financial incentive to keep pushing these divisive ideas.
So is it about changing the world, or is it about lining his own pockets? Or maybe it's a little bit of both.
That's the cynical take, but it's definitely something to consider. And then you've got the power and influence element. The more followers he has, the more attention he gets, the more seriously his ideas are taken, even by the political establishment. Even bad press can actually boost his platform.
It's like that saying, there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Exactly.
Which brings us right back to that Potsdam meeting. Even if mainstream politicians condemn his ideas, the fact that they're even being discussed gives him a certain level of legitimacy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Events like that normalize extremist views, and they create this climate where those views become more acceptable to the general public. It's a slippery slope for sure.
So how can our listeners, with all this information coming at them from all sides, how can they tell the difference between a genuine visionary and a skilled con artist? Especially when both types are so good at manipulating the media and public opinion.
That's the million-dollar question in this day and age, isn't it? There's no easy answer, but I think awareness is key. You've got to be on the lookout for these dog whistles, these appeals to emotion, the demonization of opponents, the creation of those echo chambers we were just talking about. Those are all tools of manipulation, regardless of whether the cause is good or bad.
So it's all about critical thinking and media literacy, like being able to recognize those tactics and really scrutinizing your sources of information.
Exactly. Don't just take things at face value. Do your own research, consider different perspectives, and be skeptical of anyone who claims to have all the answers, no matter how charismatic or convincing they might seem.
That's some solid advice for navigating the world today. But let's get back to Sellner specifically. What kind of legacy is he building? What's his impact?
It's hard to deny that he's been successful in bringing this idea of remigration into the mainstream political conversation. And while there aren't many politicians who openly support his specific proposals, this whole notion of reducing immigration, especially Muslim immigration, it's gaining traction across Europe. He's really tapped into this anxiety that a lot of people feel about cultural change and national identity.
So he's shaping public opinion, even if it's indirectly.
Absolutely. He's definitely playing a role. And with the rise of right-wing populism, figures like Sellner are likely to become even more influential. It's a trend we need to pay attention to, for sure.
Okay, let's switch gears for a second and talk about Sellner on a personal level. He's married to Brittany Pettibone, right? The American far-right activist and YouTuber. They're quite the power couple in the extremist world.
Oh, absolutely. They're both incredibly media savvy and have a huge following online. Pettibone is known for pushing conspiracy theories, especially about things like the deep state and the globalist elite. She's also a big supporter of white nationalism. They basically feed off each other's beliefs and spread their message to a much wider audience.
Didn't they get banned from entering the UK back in 2019? Because of their extremist views.
Yeah, they spun it as censorship, but the UK government said their presence wouldn't be conducive to the public good or something like that.
It's interesting how they managed to turn these setbacks into badges of honor. Like it plays into this whole narrative that they're these persecuted outsiders who are speaking truth to power, which of course resonates with their followers.
It's a very clever tactic, using the sense of victimhood to deflect any criticism and rally their base.
And that's what makes them so dangerous. Right, they're not just these fringe figures anymore. They're actually infiltrating the mainstream and normalizing these extremist views. This is getting pretty heavy. Is there anything else we need to know about Sellner before we wrap things up?
Well, there's one incident that really highlights his connection to the broader far-right movement. Back in March 2019, just a few days after the Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand, Austrian police raided Sellner's apartment.
Wait, the Christchurch shootings? You mean that horrible terrorist attack where that white supremacist killed 51 people at 2 mosques?
Yeah, that one. It turned out that Sellner had received a donation from the shooter just weeks before the attack.
Wow, that's a bombshell. So there's a direct link between Sellner and a white supremacist terrorist.
Now, it's important to point out that Sellner condemned the attack and denied any knowledge of what the shooter was planning. He claimed the donation was just from a supporter and that he had no idea what the shooter was going to do.
But it's still a very unsettling connection. It raises questions about the kind of people he attracts and the potential consequences of his rhetoric.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that words have power and hateful rhetoric can have very real consequences in the real world.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's move on to our final takeaway and try to answer that burning question. Is Martin Sellner a visionary or a con artist? Or is it more complicated than that? Well, here we are. We've really dug deep into Martin Sellner's world, and that question's still hanging in the air. Grifter or gifted? Is he a dangerous extremist, just playing on people's fears? Or is he a misunderstood visionary trying to change things for the better?
It's tough to say for sure, really. He's a complicated guy, that's for sure. He's a perfect example of that mix of charisma and controversy we were talking about. I mean, on the one hand, he's clearly intelligent, he's articulate, and he knows how to use the media to his advantage. He's tapped into a real sense of unease that a lot of Europeans feel about how quickly society is changing.
But then there's that darker side.
Exactly. You've got his history with neo-Nazism, the whole Great Replacement theory, the Remigration idea. Those things raise some serious red flags about his real goals. Is he trying to help, or is he just exploiting people's anxieties to benefit himself?
And he even compares himself to those figures who were condemned at first, but then later on, people saw them as visionaries.
Mm.
Is there a chance that history will look back on him more favorably? Is that possible?
It could happen, I guess. But right now, that connection to the Christchurch shooter, even if it was unintentional, it casts a long shadow. Do his words create an environment where that kind of violence becomes more likely? It's a question we can't just brush aside.
It's heavy stuff. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? With so much information out there, how can they figure out who's a genuine visionary and who's just after power or money?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But Sellner's story, it really highlights how crucial critical thinking is in this day and age. With information overload everywhere you look, don't just accept everything you hear. Even if it's coming from someone who seems really compelling, look at their actions, who they associate with, what the potential consequences of their ideas could be. It's about digging deeper.
Going beyond what you see on the surface, right? Not getting caught up in charisma or easy explanations.
Exactly. Sellner's story reminds us that things are rarely black and white. There's a lot of gray area, and understanding those nuances, that's key to navigating the world today.
So what's the final verdict? Grifter or gifted?
Honestly, that's for each person to decide for themselves. We've laid out the facts, the controversies, the different points of view. Now it's up to you, our listeners, to weigh the evidence and come to your own conclusions.
Well put. This deep dive has given us all a lot to think about. And that's what grifter or gifted is all about. We encourage you to keep digging into these complex figures and how they affect our world. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, and remember, the truth is out there. Just got to keep searching for it.